Welcome, 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 everyone. We are so excited to have you here for our Bookaccino live book group event. I'm Carol Fitzgerald from bookreadinggroupguides.com, a website from the Book Report Network, and the host of the Book Reporter Talks to Videos podcast series. I'm so happy to have you here tonight, where our guest this evening is Anna Quindlen. We will be talking about her novel, After Annie. Our book reporter reviewer, Eileen Zimmerman-Nickel, had this to say in her review. Anyone who has lost someone precious will relate to these characters' grief, heartbreak, and ultimate resilience. It's a trip on a road paved with pathos, but it is one well worth taking. So let's talk about the format for tonight's event. And it's going to be as follows. And let me start by saying, as we do with every Bookaccino live book group, we're assuming that everyone here has read the book because we are going to be talking spoilers. I'm going to begin with a discussion with Anna, and then one of our readers will be joining us live to talk about After Annie. And then we are going to go to questions from the audience, and the audience is you. That's all those people who are out there right now coming into the room. So please drop your questions, any questions that you have, into the Q&A down below. And I see some people have done that already. If over in the chat, you could instead just be telling us who you are and where you're from, but make sure your questions go into the Q&A, because that's what we're really going to be looking for. That our voice of God, Tom Donadio, is going to be out looking for your questions as the event goes on. And with that housekeeping behind us, let's welcome Anna to the virtual stage.
How are you?
Good, thanks. It's
I
so good to
was
see
looking
you.
at the bottom of my screen here, and let's see, we've got Apple Valley, we've got Scotch Plains, we've got San Juan Capistrano. It's just fascinating to see. Oh, Absecon, New Jersey. I know where that is.
We know where that is.
It's just so interesting to see people coming from all over to do this. The miracle, the upside of technology.
The upside of technology. And we often say authors go to a lot of places, but they might not get to Absecon, and they might not get to a lot of these places. So here's an opportunity, or somebody might be busy the night that you're there. And we figure like this is an opportunity for people to, first of all, engage with you this evening, but also we love that they can do this with their book group later on, because they'll hear your answers to some of the best questions that they've got. So
Well, God bless book groups. And I've got to say that this time next year, I have a new novel coming, which is called More Than Enough. And More Than Enough is centered to some extent around a four-woman book group. However, unlike most book groups, the rule in Polly Goodman's book group is that they can't read the book. You
they
can't read
can't,
the book. You have to buy the book.
right?
Have to have the book, but you cannot read the book. Instead, you basically talk about menopause or your job or the kids or that kind of thing. And it's not because obviously I'm hostile to literature, because the protagonist of the book, Polly Goodman, teaches English to girls at a girls' school in New York City, and there's a lot of her curriculum in the novel.
Oh,
But there's,
okay.
but God bless book groups. They've been responsible for so much of my success, and so I'm always happy to be able to help them out.
I love it. I love it. Did you have a book that you really broke out with book clubs with? Which was the one that really you feel like put you on the map with book groups? Was there one?
I've got to say, I got to go way back. I mean, One True Thing definitely got a lot of book group coverage. I mean, I've heard over the years from people. And conversely, because it's not a novel, it's nonfiction, Lots of Candles, Plenty of Cake, which was about
Yeah.
aging, seems to have gotten a lot of traction with book clubs.
Yeah, and people just, what I think that's really interesting too is if you get invited to a book club and they start talking about one of your older books. One of my author friends said, I have to go like reread the book. Either that or they'll say something and they go, that's so interesting. She says, did I write that? That was in my
Yeah,
book.
yeah, yeah. Well, all of our memories are a little less keen than they once were.
Exactly. What's like what main character is. So in After Annie, the story is told from the viewpoints of Annie's oldest child, her daughter Allie, her husband Bill, and her best friend Anne Marie. Did you ever think about having any other perspectives, having anybody else telling the story?
I did actually. When I first started working on After Annie, I probably got 20 to 30 pages in just telling the story from the perspective of Allie, who
Mm,
is Annie's oldest child. But she's 13 years old, turns 14 during the course of the year that the book covers. And I realized pretty quickly that you were only going to be able to get a limited amount of insight into an adult woman and the span of her life through her teenage daughter. It
mm,
just wasn't going to be enough.
mhm.
And at that point, I pivoted pretty convincingly to her best friend and her husband. But early days, I thought it would just be Allie, and it didn't work.
I think, is there that moment when you're writing and you just say, I have to pivot, but which way am I going to go? And is there a day where you actually sat there and said, yeah, it could be the girlfriend and the husband, or
Yes.
right away you saw that? Right away.
Yeah, I mean, every once in a while that happens to you in a book. When I first started working on Black and Blue, which was my third novel,
Hmm.
it was a third person novel. And again, I was maybe 20 or 30 pages in, and I thought, no, no, to give this a kind of propulsive energy that it needs to have, it needs to be told in the first person by Fran Flynn, who is the person who's the center of the book. So,
Hmm.
there are things like that. Luckily, you get them early on in most cases. The wonderful novelist Dawn Tripp has a book that I thought was so fantastic that came out last year called Jackie,
Loved it.
where she
Loved it.
writes from the perspective of Jackie Kennedy.
Hmm.
And she and I share an editor.
Oh.
And she told me that she'd written the book in the third person, the entire book, and had to change it to a first person book. And I just said, Dawn, I would have given up at that point. But she didn't give up, and what she produced is really a wonderful, wonderful novel.
I agree. And the first person really made that book different from any other book you've read about Jackie. That's what
And
I felt.
utterly, utterly convincing. I mean, you didn't,
Yes.
every once in a while, when someone does a historical novel in the first person, you feel a little bit like it's an exercise in ventriloquism. You didn't feel that at all with that novel.
Mm-mm.
Recommended highly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know what you mean because it was like, completely there. So I love the one point at the funeral where everyone's telling Allie nice things about her mother. And
Right.
they're telling her mother how fabulous she was. And she remarks that no one's saying the word dead. No one's saying my mother died. And I think that's what reverberating in her head the whole time is like, why is nobody talking about my mother's not going to be around anymore? They act like, she's going to come over and walk over. And she said that like people are saying nice things like dead people are perfect or like that they're very, very good. And that makes her wonder. And it made me think of every wake and funeral I've gone to. I'm of Italian
Yep.
background, so you can just imagine what the wakes and the funerals have been like, right? And there are lots of words, but the situation is the same. Someone's not coming home. Someone's not coming back. And it's like this grown up observation I felt like from Allie, because every time you go someplace, that's what's ending up happening. But she's the one that says, but my mom's not around anymore. Was
Right.
this something that you really loved about seeing with Allie, that this is the way she could feel about it?
Yeah, and it's also the way I feel about it. I mean, I I don't want to hear about how somebody's in a better place.
Mm-mm,
I don't want to hear how they've passed away.
mm-mm,
Um, you know, one of the things that we try to do as human beings to insulate ourselves, not only from grief and loss, but honestly from our own mortality, is to pretty up death.
mm-hmm,
It's why funeral homes exist,
mm-hmm.
so that they can try to pretty up somebody, and as my father once said, you turn you turn into the centerpiece at a cocktail party.
Oh, I love that one.
It was when he decided not to have a wake. But anyhow, um, and prettying it up estranges us from the reality of it.
Hmm.
And I think this is a very smart girl. She's an eldest child, and birth order means a lot to me. And she understands that this is phony.
Hmm.
This is phony. She hasn't lost her. That's another thing.
Yeah, lost.
You lost your mother.
Hmm.
No, let's talk about what's really going on here in the service of dealing with what's really going on here. And I feel that really profoundly
Hmm.
um, about death and grief and loss. And part of that feeling of mine went right into Allie.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of times I'll say to people, treasure your memories. That's the one thing. Like, just hold on to every memory. And the only good thing about Awake or something like that is you may hear about something like your father's childhood story that you never would have heard and never would have known. And there's something kind of nice about that. Like, you're going to hear from people, but then it's still, he's dead. I mean, I'm still dealing with like what we're going to have to do next. It's not going to be pretty. And her mother was so young. And that's the other thing too. She realizes her other friends are not the same. Their moms aren't dead. She's the one who has the dead mother. Yeah.
Well, it definitely sets you apart. There's a very, very good
Hmm.
nonfiction book that's been around for decades by Hope Edelman called Motherless Daughters.
Hmm.
And it's about how motherless daughters become different from those around them. It's very psychologically apt. But I think that idea of treasuring the memories and knowing the stories is why Allie stays close to Anne Marie,
Right.
because Allie's only known her mom for 13 years since she was born, but Anne Marie's and Annie have known each other since they were 6. And so there's a whole nother Annie that exists for Anne Marie in a way that you can tell Allie wants to be able to access.
Yeah. I want to be able to be part of that. Tell me a story. Tell me a story about my mom. Tell me about my mom going to the prom. Tell me like what happened to her. And you can do it. And you're also not going to give the filtered version that the grandmother might give. You're going to give me exactly how she felt that day. She was like
Right.
not in a good mood. She didn't really like the guy. Like whatever's going to happen, you're going to be the one that tells the truth.
But also Anne Marie has no filter.
The
So
perfect person.
Allie knows she's going to get the unfiltered version. And that's one of the reasons why Bill mistrusts Anne Marie. I mean, the essential reason why he mistrusts her is because at one point it says in the novel, no man really likes his wife's best friend. But part of it also is that he knows that you can never be sure what's going to come out of Anne Marie's mouth,
Right.
which I really love.
Yeah. It was like she got to be the person on the page that just said it. She didn't have the edit filter. She was just saying it.
But it's so interesting because I was at a bookstore event. I can't remember what city it was in when you're on book tour.
They
You
all
know, you
melt
wake in
together.
the middle of the night and think, am I in Nashville? You know, you can't quite figure out where you were yesterday and where you're going tomorrow. But I was in some city and this woman came up to ask me to sign the book and she'd read it already. And she said, God, I hated Anne Marie. And the woman behind her went, What? You hated Anne Marie? And they got into this whole back and forth. And I was sitting there just listening. But the lizard part of my writer's brain was going, Okay, Anna, you completely made up a human being who these two women are so invested in that they're fighting about her. And that means that your work here is done.
A fabulous job. I love it. I love it. And I love that feeling of you don't know what city it's in. I used to travel on business a lot, and I used to love the wake up call where they'd say, Good morning, Carol, it's 8 o'clock, which they don't do anymore. Okay.
Right.
And I used to say, What city am I in? What time zone is it? Because you'd never know. You just would have gone a city a day, and you're like, Where am I going today? And what am I going to do? So I can just imagine being on book tour where you're also usually getting up at 4 a.m. because there's
Right.
some train that you
To
something
go to the
get
next
on.
one.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, Debbie Moore is going to join us now from Myrtle Beach. Debbie has been with us for just about every Bookaccino live book group and always has wonderful questions. So, Debbie, you're on.
Oh, thanks. Anna, it's so nice to meet you. I love your books and your stories of families, and they're just wonderful. And my first question is a little bit about memories again, because that's really how we get to know Annie the most. Do you think that our memories of our relationships with those we love, that it's that that helps us heal and grieve when someone we love dies.
Well, I'm not such a proponent of the healing thing because I sort of feel, I mean, grief gets less and less and less, but loss is forever.
That's true.
What I think it does do, which is invaluable, is that it makes a person be alive. I mean, when I set out, Debbie, to write this book, I usually have some inchoate sense of telling a story and engaging the reader. But I realized that at some level, I wanted the most alive character, the most vivid, accessible person in this book to be the person who died in the first sentence because I felt like it illustrated something really important about what happens to us when someone we love dies. And that is that we stop taking them for granted.
Mhm.
When they're alive, we sort of walk past them in the kitchen and we sit next to them in the car and don't pay any attention to what they're saying. And then suddenly, when they're gone, in some ways they become more real for us than when they were really there. And
Mhm.
at some level, I suppose that's a great tragedy that we don't pay attention enough to the people we love when they're actually there. But on the other hand, it helps keep them alive. I mean, you know, I guess my Sibs and I were just talking about this not long ago. At some level, our mother, who has now been gone dead for 52 years,
Wow.
no, 53 years,
Wow.
is still in some small way alive.
Mhm.
That ends with us. That ends with us. When the five of us are gone, then she's really gone. Then she's really dead. I mean, it's kind of a domino effect
Mhm.
at some level. And one of the things that I feel incredibly lucky about as a mother is that when I'm dead and my children are trying to remember who I was, there's a big shelf full of books that will tell them.
That's right.
All they have to do is pull one of them off the shelf, and boy, will Anna Quindlen be alive for them.
Oh, I
And
love
I
it.
didn't think of it when I first became a writer, or even when I was first writing about them when they were young, when I was doing a column for the Times called Life in the 30s.
Mhm.
At a certain point, it hit me that I was going to be able to leave that behind, and that was this incredible gift that I'd given myself.
Mm.
Hmm. I love
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that's um although we barely get to meet Annie before she dies, by the end of the book I felt like I knew her, or at least I knew that she was a person I wish I had known.
Yeah.
And I began the book thinking it would be a sad story, but by the end I thought it was a comforting story, bringing back memories of friends and family members who had died. Did you hope that readers would find comfort in Annie's story?
Yes, I did. I mean, I've only written one novel that I think was sort of overwhelmingly dark. Um, Certainly halfway through, even to some extent at the end, and that's a novel called Every Last One.
Mm.
And in fact, the reason that I then followed that with a novel called Still Life with Breadcrumbs
Mhm.
was because I thought I got to dig my way out of this psychic hole.
Mhm.
And I'd never before written an unalloyed love story, and I'd never written a novel that had an absolute happy ending. And both of those things are true about Still Life with Breadcrumbs. And one of the reasons is because I'd gone so dark in every last one. So I felt like this was a kind of a balance. Sure, at some level, it's an incredibly sad book, but
Mhm.
I think by the end, each of them have learned something really important about themselves
Mhm.
through remembering Annie and through having had a life with her that will serve them in really good stead in the years to come.
Mm.
Um, Going back a little ways to a question Carol had asked about the fact that, you wrote it from three perspectives. How did you write that? Did you write, Allie's perspective from December to December and then go on to Anne Marie and then go on to Bill, or did you write them month by month?
No, I was bouncing in and out of them. I mean,
Mhm.
the book takes place over a year, and I'm a writer who really writes that way. I can't do a piece here and a piece there. I really write pretty much, straight ahead. And but I sort of got them. They were different enough from each other, and I got them early enough that I didn't have a whole lot of trouble pivoting from one to the other, which, it could have been a problem. And again, it might have been more of a problem, Debbie, if I'd been writing any of them in the first person. But
Mhm.
of course, I wasn't. It was a third person sort of overview look at them.
Well, thank you very much. It's been really nice to meet you. I'm looking forward to your book next year already. It sounds very fascinating.
Thanks.
Uh,
I
and
really, I really, really like it. I really like when I'm writing a first person book and I really like the protagonist, which was the case in Black and Blue. I loved Fran Flynn. I really missed her when I was finished with her. But Polly Goodman, who's the protagonist of this book, I really, really like. And that made it, uh, I won't say enjoyable. I find writing extremely difficult, and I'm constantly backstopping myself and thinking, this is boring. No one's going to read this. What are you doing? But liking Polly as much as I did helped me a lot.
Helps you out telling the
thank you
story that
very much.
way. Debbie, as always, thank you so much for joining us. Debbie always
Yeah,
brings really
thanks,
good
Debbie.
questions.
Thanks.
Really brings good questions. You know, wait, do we have a month when your book is coming out? Is it slated the next book? Do they have
I
timing
don't
yet?
think I think that it's probably this time next year, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
They always do that thing where they figure out, who else is coming out at the same time and when it will be good for you to go on tour and
Right.
all that sort of stuff. So I leave that to the very gifted people at Random House who have taken care of me for so many years.
And you just sit there and go, wait, this time of year would be good. There'll be less snow, less delays. That would be okay. But you guys go figure it out. But February, really don't hang there too long, Don't hang there too long. So, you know, Allie calls her mom's phone to hear her voice. And I really love that. It's this little touchstone to her. And one thing I realized today is that there's so little tangible things that you can have to remember somebody. We don't write notes, we don't do anything along those lines. And it's this correspondence for people to look back on. And there isn't really. What are you going to do? Save every email that you've gotten? And then what if you change providers? Or what if something ends up happening? And I really felt this the other day. We were finding a box of Cuisinart art parts on the top of the refrigerator in the laundry room. And we took them down and I was just like pulling them out. And then there was a note from my mom who died in 2022. And I just looked there and I was like, oh my gosh, she just said, Tom, hope you enjoy these, like enjoy cooking because my husband enjoys cooking as much as I do. And I was just there like, wow, that was like this moment. And it's like, what are your thoughts about notes? Like, because there isn't note writing the same way it was. There are
Well,
cards.
that's something that I wrote about in the nonfiction book I wrote, Write for Your Life,
Mhm.
Carol,
Right?
because I wrote about the fact that 150 years ago, writing wasn't consigned to professional writers. Everybody wrote.
Mhm.
If you wanted to communicate to anybody, you had to write them a letter. People kept diaries, people kept notes and thoughts about their own lives. And I really want I don't want to I called them civilians in the book. I really want people who aren't professional writers
Mhm.
to think about writing, especially for the sake of their families.
Mhm.
And it can be done on the computer if you want, but at a certain point, just write something in longhand. I mean, why do people stand in long, long lines for me to sign my name in
Mhm.
a book? Because it shows I was there, they were there, we had this moment. And
Mhm.
that's so much more powerful when what you see are the words on the page that were written by somebody that you love. And you
Mhm.
can say, you know, she was there. I mean, I have a few pieces of writing that have my mother and my father's handwriting on it. And at some visceral level, it proves they existed.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's why it's really important to do it, even if it's just a note that you scribble for somebody. I'm
Mhm.
still a big fan of the handwritten note for certain things. For example, I don't really believe in writing condolence emails. I
Mhm.
mean, if I've just heard that somebody has died, I will immediately reach out and say, I'm thinking of you. And then I sit down with my box of stationery and my pen and I write them a note because I just feel like there are certain there are certain circumstances where you need to bring your A game,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
that's one of them.
Yeah. I wish I had better handwriting. When my children were in school, they asked me if their mother was a doctor because I wrote so bad. My handwriting is so bad. I mean, literally, the first line is beautiful and it really decays like so quickly, like because my thoughts are ahead of my hand and I'm just going like this. So there are times where I confess I have typed beautiful notes to people and slipped them in more gorgeous cards and done that because I said, if not, they're going to be going, and she said, what? What was she talking about with our mother?
Well, I don't mean to brag, but I'm frequently asked if I went to Catholic school.
And I
So that
did.
tells you something about my handwriting.
See, I did. And I also could do like, I could recite things because we had to memorize the catechism. You had to
Right.
memorize all these things. But the handwriting, I don't know. I think it's because I think too fast and then it's like I can't keep up. I don't know. I also love that the book was divided by seasons. And did you always visualize it was going to be this is spring? Because it is this the first spring you go through, like what we went through without my mom, the first Christmas, the first whatever. And it is the firsts. It is the first. The seconds are hard too, but the firsts. Did you always say this is going to be this would happen this season and whatever?
I didn't in the beginning. I just envisioned it going over the course of a year, but it became inevitable when I was writing about the surroundings um, in this town at this house. Um, that when I made that part of the description, the background, that you were inevitably going to notice that, you know, at a certain point there were no leaves on the trees, and then
Mhm.
at another point there were daffodils. And it made me think about the fact that there's a certain inevitability to the resurgence of the ordinary natural world that outstrips your loss.
Mhm.
So, you know, the daffodils came up every year, but this year they come up and she's not there.
Right.
And I think that that's in some ways such a touchstone, particularly if your mother happened to be the person who planted those daffodil bulbs or
Mhm.
put in that tree or took care of those rose bushes. And over time, it became clear to me that seasonal change was going to be part of this.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful thought because it is the first time those daffodils are coming up, the first time these things are happening. When my mother-in-law, she was a big gardener, passed away, my sister-in-law went and planted snowdrops so that they would come up in February. She just felt like mom would love to see those. And then she said, could you go over and take pictures? Because she lived in Florida. So we're driving over taking pictures of the snowdrops. And those little things will just make you feel connection, make you feel some closeness that you may not be able to feel at this moment. Well, I hope that our readers have been dropping questions into the Q&A, not into the chat. And our Voice of God, Tom Donadio, do you have questions for us? Tom's our amazing editorial director.
Yes, thank you, Carol. We do have some really good questions. First from Karen. She wants to know, why was Annie's nuclear family left out of the main story?
Hmm.
Well, you know, you're always picking and choosing how big a net you're going to cast. And of course, there's a mention of Annie's nuclear family and the fact that there's a schism in it. And also that Annie has this sister who sort of feels that she and Anne Marie feel like they're in competition with each other. So there is that part of her nuclear family. But I tend to write a pretty tight novel. I usually come in at about 320 pages, something like that. And I tend to have a pretty fixed focus. And in this case, I felt like m more of that would be discursive in a way that would take your focus away from the three people who I was using. But I totally understand saying what happened to X, what happened to Y. I remember when they were making the movie version of One True Thing, the actor William Hurt insisted on meeting me for breakfast. And he sat me down. He was playing George Golden, who's the father of the protagonist and the husband of, I guess, both Kate and Ellen are the protagonists. And he said, "Now, I really want to know George's backstory. I really want to know, how he was raised and what his, and I said, Bill, everything I know about George Golden is in the novel." And he said, "Oh, nonsense. I mean, you must have developed a whole backstory for him." And I said, "No, no, I actually didn't. What's in the novel is what I know about him, but you can develop a whole backstory for him." So then he's very dissatisfied with this answer, and we break, and he goes back, and the next day, um, the producer says to me, what did you tell Bill Hurt?" And I said, "Well, the problem is I didn't really tell him anything." And he said, "Well, he's insisting that hair and makeup wax his hairline." And I was like, wait, George's backstory is that he was balding, which probably was true given his age, but still. And he said, "Yeah, he's insisting." So I said, "Well, obviously he came up with his own backstory." So I sort of stay in my lane with the story and the characters. And there could be all kinds of things happening outside of that lane that, for one reason or another, I choose not to include.
Love it.
We have a question from Tony. Why did you decide to include Jenny's sexual abuse experience in this novel?
Yeah, I keep getting a lot of questions about that. And at some level, I've wanted to say because that's what happens in the world. But that's not really true. I mean, I wanted to do a kind of a compare and contrast because Allie, watching her mother and Anne Marie all these years, clearly would understand the incredible value of a best friend. And in fact, she had had a best friend who moved away, which, as we all know, often happens. So she's entered into this friendship with Jenny, and I think that she feels like she can't penetrate Jenny's persona in the same way that her mother and Anne Marie have been able to do with each other. And there's clearly a reason for that. And she also can't quite understand the way Jenny lives and why Jenny isn't happier and all that kind of thing. And I think that it's a mirror to some extent of what goes on with Anne Marie and Annie, except that Anne Marie's issues that set her apart from Annie developed much later in their friendship. And the issues that set Jenny apart from Allie develop really early on. And I also think Allie, after her mother dies, begins to realize that the sense of control that she thought existed in the world, especially among adults, is kind of ephemeral. And one of the things she learns about through eventually learning what's been going on behind closed doors with her friend Jenny is that the adults pretend that they have it all together and that they know how to deal with difficult situations like death, like sexual abuse. But the truth is, they don't. And it's a lesson that I think every kid learns at a certain point. um, with great difficulty. And she learns it twofold during the course of the year that this story covers.
Very much so.
Um, we have a few questions about your personal experiences and how that ties into the book. So I just wanted to start with what Mary has to say. She says, I once lived in a small town, one street over from a lovely woman who worked in a local store and decorated the porch of her charming house for every season. One night she went to bed with a headache and never woke up. She died from an aneurysm. Witnessing her husband and sons deal with her death made this novel really resonate with me. Did any personal experiences help shape this heartbreaking but beautiful story? And there's a similar question. Lisa wanted to know, was there a specific event or trigger that inspired you to write a book about a young woman who died? Um, and then I also just wanted to point out something that Terry says. She says, I was particularly struck by the early line that grief is like spring, and what in your life experiences prepared you to write so eloquently about grief, especially that of children.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of different ways I can answer that. It's different than it was when I wrote, for example, about grief in One True Thing, which I wrote when I was in my 40s, because I'm now 72 years old. And what that means, of course, is that some of my friends have died over the last 10 to 20 years. I was just talking about that with my sister-in-law at lunch today. Some of my closest friends, and that will continue to happen. I remember after my father died, he was one of seven children, and my Uncle Jack was the youngest. And I was at the lunch afterwards, standing with Jack, and he turned to me and said, sort of ruefully, last man standing. And, you know, a lot of us have known people who were the last man standing. At the other end of the continuum, my mother died of ovarian cancer when I was 19 years old. I'm the oldest of five children. The whole family kind of came apart. It was at a time where nobody ever went to therapy. People people wouldn't even use the word cancer. Some people still thought it was contagious. There was no hospice. There were no portacaths to deliver chemotherapy. So it was a whole different world. But I certainly learned about grief and loss really early on. Could I have written about it then? Absolutely not. It took me many years to metabolize it. And in fact, I think probably I did so convincingly for the first time in 1985 or 86. Yeah, 86, 87, 88. I wrote a column for the New York Times called Life in the 30s, which ran once a week in the paper and in about, I think almost 100 papers nationwide syndicated. And the executive editor made it up out of whole cloth because he wanted to keep me in the tent at the same time that I'd had two little boys in under 2 years, and I was not coming back to the office anytime soon. And we didn't, it was like, what is she going to write about? And the third column was a column called Mothers and Daughters, and it begins something like, I'll meet you in the lobby. I'm 5'3". I have long brown hair. I'm wearing a red coat, and my mother died when I was 19. That's all you need to know about me. And all of a sudden, this was the third column. I mean, this was still when snail mail was king. There were hundreds of, I mean, we didn't know what to do. I wasn't in the office, but they're calling me and saying there's boxes and boxes and boxes of letters. And part of that, I think, was because a lot of female readers felt like the New York Times didn't speak to them. And suddenly there was clearly a youngish woman with young children who was speaking to them. And part of it was because they felt like the New York Times didn't write about things like this. And And part of it was, I think that they could feel that for me, this column was a little bit of a jack in the box. I was turning the handle and the little guy was popping up. And that was the beginning through writing of being able to metabolize this. Now, you may see that the dedication in this book says for PMQ, which is my Prudence Marguerite Quindlen, one last time, because over the years it's been, I'm not exactly writing about my own life, but one day I had left college to take care of my mother with very bad grace, I might add. I was not an angel of mercy in any way, shape, or form. And we were in the kitchen, and she said to me, "Now you'll have something to write about." And I was kind of ticked off because I felt like she was seeing me as a kind of a literary vampire. Guess what? I was for the rest of my life. And none of it's direct. Annie bears no resemblance to my mother. Allie bears a little bit of a resemblance to the young Anna, but not so much, that kind of stuff. But over the course of your lifetime, you metabolize certain ways of being in the world and understanding the world and understanding other people. And, that's how the sausage of a novel gets made. You grind it all up and you put it into new people, and hopefully, you understand something about the human condition that's important. I mean, I was really struck by a comment in a interview he did in which Elon Musk said that the biggest problem that we have today is empathy, and that empathy is a kind of a weakness when you cleave too much emotionally to other people. If we did not have empathy, we would not have literature. The only way for Chekhov to write his plays, the only way for Tolstoy to write Anna Karenina, or Dickens to write Bleak House, or Ann Tyler to write, or Amy Bloom to write, or Ann Patchett to write, is to be deeply, deeply empathetic at some level. And I think that's what you bring to the table, that cleaving to human emotion, some of which you've experienced, some of which you've passed through, but all of which becomes grist for the mill.
And it's not a quick TikTok, and it's not a quick this, and it's not a quick that. It's really thinking and emoting the way you feel, like emotion wise, not just an emoji, emoting the way you feel. It really is. But it's also the antithesis of tech, because tech is all AI, this, that, the other thing, quick, 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 shortcut, this, that, the other thing. And it's so different from really being having emotion and feeling and
But
talking.
it doesn't have to be either or. I
Mm-mm.
mean, I
No,
know
it
we have
doesn't.
this great fear of AI, and I was appalled to discover that Meta was training some of its bots on my work without asking me, paying me, getting permission from me. But, all of tech has really positive uses. We have one of them right
Right
in front
now.
of us right now. And then all of it has negative uses. Same with AI. And writing can have, I mean, you can look at the book of the John Birch Society and realize that you can produce writing that can do great harm.
Hmm.
But then you look at so many novels and think this enables us to be better than our small selves, and what could be greater than that?
And what could be greater than sharing your thoughts, sharing this and having a conversation about it and sparking a conversation about it?
So Pat is curious to know, are your New York Times columns available somewhere?
Yes. My Life in the 30s columns are in a collection called Living Out Loud, and my op-ed page columns are in a collection called Thinking Out Loud. And believe me, All three of my children at various times have suggested laughing out loud, screaming out loud. Um, I mean, anything that you could think of to diss the writer, I've already heard at the kitchen table.
Okay, Mom.
Um,
You're titling. You're titling. So you own the rights to those columns, yes, so that you could put them in the book? Like you can't go to NewYorkTimes.com and find them, correct?
yeah, you can,
You can do
yeah.
that too. Okay.
If you put my name in and then,
Okay.
you know, go back a number of years and everything, you can find them, but they're all collected
In the
in
books. Okay.
yeah.
You alluded to this a couple of minutes ago, but Donna wants to know, how do you create a character? Is it based on someone you know, or maybe a variety of people?
You know, in the past, I've likened it to the old-fashioned Polaroid photographs. Remember, you'd pull it out, and at first it would just be black, and then you would start to see gray shapes, and then they'd get
Right.
clearer and clearer. And then after a couple minutes, it was like an actual clear photograph. What happens is, it's so funny when I was doing an event at Parnassus in Nashville, represent Nashville if anybody's on this from there. Ann Patchett and I were saying there's three things that we both do where we're writing, but it doesn't look like we're writing. Walking, driving, and cooking,
Mm.
where you know you're not actually putting words on a page, but there's all this stuff going on in your head. And so usually I start walking around. It's kind of happening right now. Unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to start writing again, maybe in June. But it's starting to happen right now. But you start seeing like a little bit of a glimmer. You know, I remember with Still Life with Breadcrumbs, you know, Rebecca, I want to write about this woman who was a photographer, and she's from, yeah, she lives in New York, and she's kind of famous for photographs that she took a while ago. And little by little it was like, okay, Rebecca's an only child. She had this kind of mother, she had this kind of father, she had this kind of first husband. And at a certain point, it became clear to me that one of the things the novel was going to be about was about money. Because one of the things that I'm struck by all the time is there are people who are really famous, like actors who you will see on the street. Oh my God. But they're famous for something that they did 20 years ago, and that doesn't pay the mortgage.
Hmm.
And so the question is like, how do you keep it? And in Rebecca's case, she's in trouble financially. And it suddenly occurred to me that we almost never write about money in modern novels, which is so interesting since everybody seems so obsessed with it. I
Hmm.
mean, when I started to think about novels that are about money and not having money and what that feels like, I had to go all the way back to Edith Wharton and the House of Mirth and how Lily Bart's entire existence is shaped by the fact that she has no money, you know? Um, and um, and you know, of course, Dickens writes about it all the time, most notably in Little Dorrit. So the character begins to build in you, and you start to know things about them, and then at a certain point, and I hesitate to say this because it does make me sound kind of like a whack job, but at a certain point, like the character starts to like, you can kind of hear them talk, and you can
Hmm.
kind of hear them talk to other people, and you can kind of, and you're thinking, okay, now it's time to sit down.
Hmm.
And that's usually by that time you have an idea of where you want to begin, what the first chapter is going to feel like. And that's good because if the first chapter comes easily, that makes you think the rest will, and it never does. But it's kind of a, you know, a Linus blanket. Oh, I got that first chapter down.
Okay.
It's always about 50,000 words in that you think, I've wasted my life. This doesn't work. No one's going to read it, but I've gone too far to turn back now.
Hmm. Don't turn back. Just keep going. We're all waiting for the 51,000
Okay.
word, you know. But no, so
Yeah.
many writers have said we get to a point and it's like, why am I doing this? This isn't
Right.
going to turn out. Or I've had people tell me I finished the book and what's up on, Amazon and places that's about the book, that's not really it. I'm doing something else and I have like 5 weeks to fix it, but it's going to be okay. And then we'll change that. And we're like, okay, whatever you say. But,
I
and then,
always do feel like I'm pushing the rock uphill. But having said that, I'm not a pediatric oncology nurse. I'm not a seventh grade teacher. Those are really hard jobs. I find this job hard, but my beloved editor, Kate Medina, who has edited all my books,
Mhm.
at one point I was complaining on book tour where I stay in really nice hotels and, you know, and I was complaining and she said, no whining on the yacht. And I remind myself of that all the time. No whining on the yacht.
No, why? Yeah. But wait, when you're thinking of this, you're walking around, you're thinking of this character. Do you make any notes? Do you scroll anything like on back of receipts or someplace to just hold something in your head or it's there?
Not then, but later on, like I'm two-thirds of the way through, and I'm dropping off to sleep at night, and I suddenly think Anne Marie do, Anne Marie thinks this, or Anne Marie once did that, or something. And sometimes I'll scroll myself a little note, and I would say probably half the time the next morning I look at it and think, "What the hell is this?" And the other half of the time I actually use it.
One author told me one time that she wrote something on the steam in the shower. And she said she had to go cap because she was really on a roll. And she said then she realized the steam was going to go away. So she had to go in very quickly and be writing down what she
Yeah,
saw
yeah.
on the shower wall. Yeah.
When I'm in the shower, I'm spending all my time trying to figure out whether the bottle I'm holding is shampoo, conditioner, or shower gel because they don't write it in big enough letters. And I think half the time I'm washing my hair with like exfoliating cream or something.
I'd be like half bold later just because I couldn't read. So true. So true. I always grab shampoo instead of conditioner. And I've now dumped this massive conditioner on my head. And I'm like, why? Why did I do that? Or you finish shampooing and you put more on your head because you have the wrong bottle. I'm like, "God, this is so bad. So bad." Tom, is there another good question?
Yes. Well, I'm curious to know the answer to this based on what you were talking about characters. Jerry wants to know, how do you deal with letting your characters go when you're finished with the
Mm.
book?
That's really interesting. This sounds so harsh and hard. I'm kind of done with them. It's a little bit like if you lived in one town and you moved to a new town and you say you're going to keep in touch, and for a little while you do, but then inevitably you get caught up in the life of the new town, and so you're not keeping in touch as much with the neighbors in the old town. And that kind of happens to me. I mean, when I leave a novel for a while, well, when I leave a novel, then a little time goes by and I start a new one. And then I get pulled back into the one that I'd finished because then I have to go on book tour. There's kind of a long runway to do this. People seem to assume that you finish a novel and, 3 months later it's in bookstores. It's usually about 14, 15 months, from the time that you lock down your manuscript to the time that you actually have a hardcover book in your hands, because you've got all the copy editing, you've got the marketing plans, you've got the all important cover, all kinds of other stuff, setting up the tour and everything. So there's kind of a long runway. And during that long runway, I've usually started a new novel, God willing, or a nonfiction book about something completely different. So I sort of wind up back in the world of that novel for 2 or 3 months when I'm doing book tour. But then kind of I let them go. And I've been asked so many times whether I'll ever write a sequel. And that just doesn't seem like the way to go to me. It seems like I've just moved from one town to another one.
Mhm. And you're visiting it on the road. And then
Yes. Yes.
And the on the road, really, I don't think people realize how far it comes after the book is done and how
Yeah.
much has to happen in the meantime. I mean, books are announced now usually 9 months before they come out, but you're on to doing your other thing because usually the book is in pretty good shape by that point. You may be
Yeah.
making a few last minute decisions in tour, and then you're going on tour. And many times people are saying, I'm writing a book and I've got to pull myself back into for 3 months straight. I'm going to be talking about something else. I'm going to be on
You
tour.
do. You have to pivot back and given how long that runway is, I've almost always started another book
Hmm.
because of course I'm constantly finishing a novel and thinking, well, I probably won't ever be able to write another one. And then somehow it happens.
Yeah.
This is More Than Enough is number 11, I guess, of the novels.
And okay, so what we're also thinking about too is, and I have this thing right now that I'm thinking about with publishing. Often when the book comes out and after the tour is done, people are just discovering the book. The discovery, I think, is happening much later than it used to. I think it used to happen much earlier. And I feel like when the book comes out is really where the game really needs to ramp up because then it's in readers' hands. Then it's people are able to go out and talk about it. And so many times I feel like we're just walking away. We're going on to the next book. Publishing is moving on to the next title. And I'm like, whoa, 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 hold here for a little while longer. It hasn't even made it into the library yet. It hasn't even made it into, it's sold out in that store. It's just bubbling up over here. And we're on to the next thing. And I feel the runway is longer than it we used to think it was because now we've got the internet and this and that. I don't think it is. I think it's taking longer time for people to find things. There's so much is
Well,
coming at
I'm
them.
actually kind of lucky, Carol, because I tend not to sell like that. I
Mhm.
do. Look, we all know there are kaboom writers.
Mhm.
There's especially some of the mystery guys who are, by the way, all great guys. And but so the book comes out and 10 days later they're number 1 on the Times list, right? Or they're number 2 on the Times list.
Mhm.
And then the following week you look at the Times list and if they're lucky they're number 10 and the
Mhm.
following week you look at it and they've come off the Times list because they're
Mhm.
a kaboom writer. They're a
Yes.
right. I've always, even though I usually wind up on the Times list. Um, I tend to be somebody who, somebody just sent me sales figures from Random House, and the hardcover of this book and the paperback just came out, tends to sell, some several hundred copies every week.
Right.
So it's much more that kind of word of mouth, the book
Mhm.
clubs, that kind of thing. And I feel really lucky to be that kind of writer. And also, when I'm on tour or when I'm doing something like this, people also will sometimes or frequently buy the backlist
Mhm.
titles. And so then you get, more. But I just saw this great quote from Jeffrey Eumenides, who said, I don't think about the market and um I don't think about what else did he say? He said, all I think about is the reader.
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
about one person
Mhm.
who is giving over a chunk of their life to me.
Mhm.
And that's how I think too. I don't think about, they like me to think about marketing and doing this and doing that. And, I'm on Instagram and I'm happy to do it. But I always think about just that one person
Mhm.
who's reading my book.
And I want that person to go out and talk about it and say, you've all got to go read it and you want to
Right,
go do this. And that's
right.
what I think is this longer tail that's going on these books, especially your books, because people find it and say, you've really got to go read this. This is really great. And
Well,
hit
I
it.
can actually do that right now and say that in June there's a new Amy Bloom novel, and she's one of our greatest living novelists, and
Mhm.
it's as wonderful as Away and all of her other books. So you all ought to get the new Amy Bloom in June.
There you go.
I love selling other people's books. I mean,
Yeah.
it's why I love being on Instagram just so I can promote other people's books.
Yeah. And we did that with Jackie earlier, Dawn's book. I mean,
Yeah.
There were these books that you walk
Jennifer
away.
Haig has a new novel. I mean, come on, there's so many great people writing out there. It's fantastic.
And all it does is it keeps people reading. The more that people are out reading, the more that they're going to want to be reading. And I think that's, that's part of the game right now, is to just make people say, I want to go out and do this and enjoy it. And we're the over 40 market. I mean, I'm not afraid to say that on Book Reporter Reading Group Guides. And that's what we're trying to deliver on an ongoing basis is this is what you want to read and this is why.
Uh-huh.
This is what you want to do. Tom, do you have another question? Because the questions have been great.
Yes, we do. Anna asks, what reactions to this book have you heard from women who don't have good relationships with their moms? I struggle with this a bit because I do not have a close relationship with my mother for my mental health. What have you heard from women who share this experience and lose their mothers?
I haven't actually heard a lot. I mean, the most outspoken readers when I was on tour were readers who had recently experienced grief, but I didn't hear so much about that difficult relationship. But I'm going to, because Polly Goodman in More Than Enough has a very, very prickly relationship with her mother, based on a whole lot of things. And I think by the end of the book, at least understands a little better who and what her mother is, but it's not, it's the first novel I've written where the mother-daughter relationship is really, really strained. I mean, I guess people might make that argument about One True Thing too, but that's because Ellen is such a snotty whatever, and she can't understand the value of her mom. But in this, these are two women, there's a real oil and water
Mm.
aspect to their relationship in this new novel that I've never quite explored before and was really interesting. Um, really interesting to me, but I didn't get it very much. Um, in fact, it basically at all on this novel.
Hmm.
What I did get, so I'm on something like a book club thing, and somebody popped up and she was really smart and introspective, and she said, I really admire how you telegraph the fact that Annie and Anne Marie are lovers without ever explicitly saying it. And I went, whoa, okay. And I said, listen, when I write a novel, once I'm done with the novel, it doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to readers. But I've got to tell you, the reason that I didn't telegraph that is because I actually don't think that's accurate. But if that's how it works for you, go with God.
Tom, do you have one more question?
Yes. Yeah, let's end it with this. Pam asks, what are two or three things that you think made After Annie such a successful novel? It was one of my favorite reads of 2024.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. Um, I'm a very character-driven novelist. I don't really care about plot very much. Um, I can't pay too much attention to style anymore because whatever my style is in some essential way baked in. It sort of comes to the table every time. So I'm always um, I'm always most invested in character. And I think one of the things that people have really responded to in this book is those three characters.
Mhm.
I think during the course of the book, you really come not only to understand, but to kind of love Allie and Bill and Anne Marie. And I think that's what worked for a lot of people, that that they're deeply felt. Um, they're deeply understood, and that's something that readers cleave to when they feel like I think readers also cleave to authenticity.
Mhm.
They don't like books where they feel like there's a puppeteer behind. I'm not capable of puppeteering. It's not one of my skill sets. Um, if I'm going to hand in a book, if I'm going to finish a novel, it's because I totally believe in these people. I could walk out the door tomorrow and think I see them on the street. And I think readers respond to that and sense it, and that's what makes the book work for people.
I would say that definitely about all your work, but especially about this book, that I'm thinking that you really feel like you knew them. You feel like you traveled with them over that year through the peaks and the valleys. And when they were in the valley, you're like, let's see how you handle it. But they get to the other side and they all get to a good place by the end. You know, you got them there. You got them there. Even if you didn't see it
They
right from the beginning.
they got them there. That's the important thing.
They got them there.
Yeah.
Okay, we look forward to what's next. Can you promise you'll come back? Because
Yeah, sure.
we had a
Sure.
fabulous evening tonight. I can tell everybody had a great time. I will send you the chat because I think you're going to love what everybody was saying. And we thank you so much for joining us. We know this is beyond the promotion time for even the paperback. So we appreciate you joining us tonight. It really meant a lot.
And thank you for everybody who's on tonight. Most of us do our work alone in a little room. So when there's actual other human beings who are sharing in this process with us, it's kind of a great feeling.
Hmm. So glad, so glad you were here, and it was nice to get to talk to you again about After Annie after a quick, conversation like a year and a half ago. So
Uh-huh.
really, really good.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
thanks
Thank
for
you so
Good
much,
joining
night.
Anna.
us. And to everyone, we have a couple of announcements to make. Tonight's event will be available on YouTube and our podcast soon. We're hoping by the end of the week, probably the beginning of next week, something like that. We'll alert you when it's live. How's that? Anybody who's registered will get that. Also, we created a new events page on tbrnetwork.com where you can sign up for all of our programs. And we have an exciting announcement tonight because we have what our next program is going to be. It is going to be our next Bookaccino Live Book Group program will be on Tuesday, April 29th. We're going to do a Tuesday, not a Wednesday, at 8 o'clock with Marjan Kamali, and we are going to be discussing The Lion Women of Tehran. So this gives you time to read the book, time to catch up on that, and be able to do that. So we will be interested in you joining us. Also, we have one event before that on our April Bookaccino Live Book Group preview will be held on Wednesday, April 9th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You sign up for our events at the Book Reporter newsletter, the Book Report Network newsletter. You'll never miss an event. We'll send you monthly notes of what's going on. And a reminder that I've done more than 220 Book Reporter Talks to interviews, including another interview that I did with Anna last year. So we'll put the link to that when we send out this follow-up to the interview tonight, because I went more in depth with her. We talked about the cover, the design, all those kinds of things as well. So some questions were the same and, some were different. And also, we thank you for making this a very special evening for both her and for us, and for joining in these events each month. We have a great time bringing them to you. And when we see how many people are participating, it really makes us smile. So thank you very much for being a part of this evening. And with that, good night.